right, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining me today for this presentation where we're going to be taking a look at risk assessment and treatment considerations for your ISMS. My name is John Laffey. I'm a technical manager here at Perry Johnson Registrars. Just a couple quick notes before we get started. All participants have been muted, but please feel free throughout the session to go ahead and ask any questions that you may have in the question and answer section of the dashboard. And following the presentation, I will spend some time hopefully answering as many questions as possible. Copies of today's presentation will be available for download shortly after the conclusion. And this webinar will also be available for viewing on our website at pjr.com under previously recorded webinars. A quick run through of some topics we're going to be covering today. We're going to look at establishing the context, approach, and criteria for risk management. Take a look at risk identification, risk analysis, and risk evaluation. We'll take a look at selecting risk treatment options, implementing risk treatment plans, evaluating levels of residual risk, and assessing effectiveness of treatment plan implemented. All right, so starting with context, approach, and criteria. The internal and external context of your organization and the scope of your ISMS are going to be the main drivers in determining what criteria will be needed for risk evaluation, impact, and acceptance. For example, contractual or regulatory requirements applicable to your organization could have a large influence on what your risk acceptance criteria will be. The risk assessment process should be reflective of the industry sector and risks related to your organization, as well as the expectations of stakeholders, which typically includes ownership, customers or clients, employees, as well as taking the current threat landscape into account. There's many different information security risk management strategies and approaches. ISO 27001 does not prescribe that a particular one be used. The standard does require that assessments be performed at planned intervals or when significant changes are proposed to occur. Additionally, the standard does not specify what the risk acceptance criteria should be or your acceptable level of risk, but it does require that you define it as part of your ISMS, as well as maintain it. Additionally, the standard also requires that risks associated with the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information be identified. So those are the types of risks that we're talking about in terms of ISO 27001, as opposed to risks of bodily harm or burning yourself or something of that nature. Confidentiality of your information, maintaining the integrity of your information, and maintaining the availability of that information when and where it's needed are the types of risks that we're concerned with here. Which can be an overwhelming task, especially if you don't have a formal approach or plan when you're first starting this process. Again, the standard doesn't require that any specific approach be used, but for the purposes of this presentation, I will kind of run through a commonly used method just to hopefully paint a better picture of what that looks like. Again, this is not implying that this is the most effective method or the one that should be used for you or your organization. Again, it's just for demonstrative purposes. So in this method, the first step is to identify the assets that are within the scope of your ISMS, keeping in mind that assets are not just hardware and software, but anything of value to the organization. For this example, let's assume that there are primary assets, which we'll call business processes and information, and supporting assets, which would be hardware, software, network, personnel, physical sites, organizational structure, etc. By identifying the primary assets, which would be the critical business processes and or information in the scope of the ISMS, you can then identify the supporting assets, which could potentially affect the confidentiality, integrity, and or availability of your primary assets. You're going to want to identify an asset owner for all identified assets, and this should be somebody who is most appropriate based on their level of responsibility and accountability for the asset. In many cases, the asset owner is also going to be the person best suited to determine the asset's value to the organization. Identify threats to the primary and supporting assets. keeping in mind that threats may be accidental or deliberate and of natural or human origin. To ensure a comprehensive list is created as well as limit the magnitude of work, consider using generic threat types or groups such as unauthorized asset access, physical damage, technical failure, and then where specific individual threats of a certain type warrant it, ensure that you go down that path and do so. Factors that would influence if a specific threat needs to be identified should include the criticality of the asset they are associated with, as well as the level of damage they could cause if realized. Additionally, when determining threats, please consider soliciting input from as many resources as you are able to. This could include asset owners, users, related staff members, legal departments, legal bodies, physical and informational security specialists, etc. The more complete threat listing you can generate, the more informed and protected you can be. So obviously that's kind of acknowledging that you don't know what you don't know, and obviously in this particular landscape, threats evolve and change at a rapid pace. There's a number of internet-based services that you can subscribe to that will update you on a regular basis. One that I know of certainly is US CERT, which is sponsored by the United States government, and they will send you as many updates as you're interested in on the latest threats from an information security standpoint point of view. The next step is to identify what existing controls are already in place or are planning to be implemented. This step may simply be a review of the existing documentation of implemented controls in place, or if this is the initial iteration of the assessment and treatment process, there may be more involved. If no existing controls documentation exists, you will need to check with the folks responsible for information security. It could be IS officer, it could be a building manager, it could be operations managers, to get a comprehensive list of controls already in place. The objective of this step is to avoid wasting time and money by duplicating controls. After completing this step, you should have a list of all existing or planned controls, as well as their implementation and usage status. Next, you're going to want to identify vulnerabilities related to your identified assets, with vulnerabilities being defined as weaknesses associated with assets or controls that can be exploited by one or more threats. Again, there are many resources that can be used to assist with vulnerability identification, including lists of common threats and associated vulnerabilities, automated vulnerability scanning tools, penetration testing, code review, etc. After performing this step, you should have a list of vulnerabilities that are related to your assets, threats, and existing controls. The ISO 27001 also requires that a risk owner is identified for all risks. And again, these owners should be the folks who have the accountability and authority to manage their identified risks. In summary, the goal of the identification process is to have a complete list of what assets are within the scope of your system, along with their associated threats, vulnerabilities, and a listing of existing and planned controls, as well as their implementation status. After getting this information, we will be ready to go ahead and start doing our risk analysis. All right. Again, there are many methods of risk analysis that can be used. And again, ISO 27001 does not require a specific methodology to be employed. But continuing with our example method, the next step would be to identify the consequences that the loss of confidentiality, integrity, and or availability may have on the assets identified. Consequence could be a loss of effectiveness, adverse operating conditions, loss of business, reputation, damages from lawsuits, etc. By taking the list of assets and associated threats and vulnerabilities, you can then draw up scenarios by describing a threat exploiting a vulnerability. So this would be a potential threat, a potential scenario. The scenario should include operational consequences in terms of investigation and repair time, time lost, opportunity lost, health and safety, financial cost, image, reputation, and goodwill. Depending on the approach chosen by your organization, a qualitative or quantitative risk analysis methodology may be in place. In short, a qualitative approach will employ a more subjective rating system for potential consequences and likelihoods, low, medium, or high, while a quantitative approach will use numerical values for consequences and likelihood typically. Each approach has its merits, and I think both can be effective methods of risk analysis. In this example approach, to determine the level of risk, the consequence and likelihood values after being determined would be combined to assign a raw risk value. At this point, you'll now have your identified risks and level of risk identified. You can then go ahead and evaluate and prioritize treating them. ISO 27001 requires that organizations evaluate their identified risks by comparing the results of your risk analysis against the criteria for performing information security risk assessments, as well as the acceptance criteria that you have determined appropriate. So basically, it's to say, these are the threats we've identified. These are the levels of risk. I'm sorry, these are the risks identified and the levels of risk we've calculated based on our criteria. You know, we say for this example, we'll say any risks that evaluate in a higher than low, let's say if there's low, medium, and high as potential values for risks, and we say our acceptable level of risk is low, so we take a look at any risks we've identified that evaluated to be medium or high, and those would be the ones that we would have to make sure that we apply some controls to mitigate those levels down to our acceptable level. The last step in this process is to use the information gathered during the previous steps to make informed decisions and take action. Again, the standard requires untreated risks that are beyond the established acceptable level to be treated. Additionally, they must be prioritized for treatment. Additional considerations besides the established acceptable level of risk that may be used include the importance or criticality of the asset the risk is associated with, as well as the degree of confidence in the risk assessment process, as well as any contractual, legal, or regulatory requirements that may apply to a given asset or risk. So at this point, we now have our risks that we've identified, we have our levels of risks, we have them prioritized in the order that we'd like to treat them, and now we have to figure out how we're going to treat them. Broadly speaking, there are 4 options typically available for treating a risk. Those would be avoidance, mitigation, transfer, and acceptance. And a quick note, these 4 options are not mutually exclusive. It's very common to see a risk be reduced to an acceptable level, at which point it is accepted by the organization. In terms of information security related risks and the requirements of the standard, the primary method of treatment will typically be the implementation or modification of controls. While the standard requires that you reference the controls in Annex A to ensure that none have been omitted that may be applicable to your system, please remember that you are free to implement controls that are not already present in Annex A as needed. So obviously there's an acknowledgement by the authors of the standard that although they believe their control set that they've included in Annex A is comprehensive, they acknowledge that obviously things can change, and the idea is that you shouldn't feel that you're limited to only select controls that are listed in that annex. The selection of controls needed should take into account the acceptance criteria that you established during your assessment, again, as well as legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements. While the risk of not complying with legal, regulatory, and contractual requirements will typically never be acceptable, for other identified risks, it is expected that the cost of implementing an ongoing maintenance of selected controls will be evaluated against the value of the asset they will protect and overall return on investment. In addition to financial constraints, the following factors should also be taken into consideration when selecting controls. Those would include time constraints. Example, given the proposed control would take an unacceptable amount of time to be implemented, Could be technical constraints where a proposed control would impact the performance of key systems, making them ineffective. Could be operational constraints, which example given would be a proposed control would require additional oversight and management that cannot be supported. Environmental constraints, proposed control would require a new facility to accommodate the space requirements. Or it could be legal constraints. An existing regulation requires data of a certain type to be encrypted in a particular manner. By considering all these factors when selecting controls, you'll be in a good position to have an attainable risk treatment plan put together. After defining your risk treatment plan, you will need to determine the levels of residual risk that exist. And basically, this is done by going through the assessment process again on your identified risks, but this time taking into account the expected effects of the proposed treatment. The level of risk expected to still remain after the treatment has been implemented is referred to as the residual risk. If residual risks exist that do not meet your established acceptance criteria, you're probably going to need to go through the treatment selection process again and try and find some options that will better treat those risks and get them down to that acceptable level once the treatment plan has been implemented. The treatment plan should also include the person or persons responsible for implementation, expected date of completion of the implementation, current status of the implementation, and must be approved by all identified risk owners, indicating their approval of the plan and acceptance of all expected residual risk. Assessing treatment effectiveness. The method of assessing the effectiveness of your treatment plan is going to depend on the nature of the risk being treated. For example, if an identified risk was an unsecured door to an area with sensitive information and was treated by the installation of a lock or card access system, it would be reasonable to see something along the lines of it being tested and verified to be working as intended. If the risk involved unpatched systems being vulnerable to attack, the treatment evaluation may be a weekly report showing numbers of unpatched systems still in use, and would most likely require ongoing monitoring to determine if the actions being taken are reducing the risk to the required level in an acceptable time frame. Other methods of evaluating treatment effectiveness may include internal or third-party audits, vulnerability scans, penetration testing, a review of the number of security incidents that have taken place, etc. Regardless of the nature of the evaluation, the most important part is that it is being done and that actions are being taken in the event a treatment option is found to be ineffective. Additionally, the status of the risk treatment plan is required to be discussed during the management review as outlined in the standard. All right, that brings us to the end of our presentation. I'm going to go ahead and open up the question and answers pane here and see if we have any. Hand up. Bear with me here. I'm trying to expand my control panel here to something that allows me to see it. Question here from Jim. Can I get a copy of the presentation? Absolutely, Jim. Again, I believe copies of the presentation are available on our website, pjr.com. But I will make sure that you get a copy of this, absolutely. Okay, looks like a question from Jay. Can you please share the specific link for the webinars? I was unable to find it for previous webinars, and I'd like to view this again later. Yeah, give me 1 second here, Jay. I think I can get that for you. Bear with me. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a second, guys. I will be back. Well, Jay, I thought I copied the link, but it doesn't look like it's letting me paste it to you. It's in this control panel. But if you can see it on my screen right now, that would be the link right there. So I hope that helped. Question here from Veronica. Is there any format that you recommend for addressing these risks? Does it need to be in a FMEA type format? So Veronica, it doesn't have to be in any specific format, but actually in a previous presentation of this webinar, I had somebody else ask me about the FMEAs, which I was ignorant to at the time, but I did take a look into I believe it's failure mode and effects analysis, and I think that it absolutely would be an acceptable way to document and demonstrate, what is being done in order to treat a given identified risk. If that helps, I hope it does. All right. So, question here from Loretta. It says, can a continuous improvement log substitute for a risk register for ISO 9001:2015? So Loretta, for ISO 9001:2015 revision, it does talk about risk-based thinking being used. Depending, without being able to see the continuous improvement log they're referring to, I would hesitate to give an absolute yes, that would be acceptable, but basically, from how I understand the requirements of ISO 9001:2015, this level of risk identification and treatment, like we're talking about for ISO 27001, isn't required. And really, there's a number of different things that can be pointed to demonstrate that risk-based thinking is being used, and it could be anything from discussions during management reviews about potential changes coming to your industry and any resulting actions, which if those types of things are being documented in a continuous improvement log, I think that could certainly speak to risk-based thinking being used as far as ISO 9001's requirements are. Right, question from Carlos. here. Once you identify internal and external context, process, scope, and interested parties with their respective expectations, having all these elements on hand, do we need to identify risk opportunities on every external context, on every internal context, on every requirement of interested parties? If not, what method can I use to mix all these elements to obtain an acceptable risk assessment? So, Carlos, I'll do my best here to try and parse all this out. In terms of identifying your internal and external context, I think largely the kinds of things that I'm thinking of when we talk about that would be really what business are you in, what types of information are you handling, who are your customers and what are their expectations, and using those kinds of ideas to frame what your risk identification, analysis, and acceptable risk levels should be. For instance, if you're in the banking industry, obviously there's going to be probably some specific regulatory and legislative requirements applied to you. Additionally, I would imagine that your risk identification process should focus on things that would be applicable to handling large amounts of money and financial related information, confidential information of that nature. It wouldn't make as much sense to, well, I don't want to say that, but I guess that is kind of my thought process for how the internal and external context of your organization and your interested parties would be driving your evaluation criteria and your acceptable level of risk. I hope that helps. Question here from Akanksha. Kindly provide example of risk assessment and treatment in the form of a register. So Akanksha, I currently don't have an example that I can provide at this time, but I'll certainly take note of this and see if I can't come up with something that would be generic enough that I think would be helpful just to maybe include in this presentation going forward. I apologize. Question here from Clive Devers. We use failure mode and analysis, design and process, and SWOT to document product, process, and system, to document product, process, and system risk. I believe that this is more than acceptable as a risk-based approach to QMS. Any comment? Clive, again, from my point of view, especially in terms of a QMS, I would certainly think that would be an acceptable demonstration of a risk-based approach. Absolutely, both those tools. Another question from Carlos. What question or definition should be used to define if a statement is a risk or opportunity? Well, I guess that's kind of just more your point of view, Carlos. In terms of ISO 27001 and its requirements, as long as you're identifying what I would consider risk, I guess I would be less concerned if you called them risks or opportunities, or what you called them, as long as they're being identified appropriately and assessed and analyzed, and then prioritized and treated as needed. So I guess to me that's kind of more semantics if we're talking about the same things, because obviously I guess I could see where some people would call it an opportunity, but I hope that helps answer your question. We update, another question from Clive. We update the risk at contract review and at management review meetings. Okay, I think that must have been in response to my response to his last question. So again, Clive, I certainly do think that would be an acceptable level, or acceptable demonstration of a risk-based approach for quality management system purposes, certainly. Another question from Carlos. Oh, it's the same one. Another follow-up from Akanksha, who had requested an example of a risk assessment and treatment register. He just commented here, basically a risk assessment and treatment evaluation in detail. So again, Akanksha, I will try and get something added to this presentation that can maybe be a better visual aid for the types of documents that one might expect to find, showing the results of their risk analysis and treatment processes. Another comment here from Carlos. Could you help us with an acceptable example of risk assessment matrix? So again, Carlos, as I was saying in reference to Akanksha's comments, I will definitely work on trying to put together an example of both an assessment and treatment register type slide or two, just so hopefully it can be something a little bit more concrete to try and attach these ideas to going forward. But currently, I don't have something like that. I apologize. Akanksha, in regards to a certificate of participation, it's not something that we currently do for these webinars. So I apologize, but I can't provide you a certificate of participation. But if you need me to vouch for you, feel free to give me an email, and I'll see if I can help you out. And again, if there's anyone here who may have additional questions and just don't feel comfortable with the format here, please feel free to reach out to us at 800-800-7910, or you can email me directly at jlaffey@pjr.com, which should be on the screen right here as well. All right, guys. Well, I appreciate everybody joining me today. Again, I hope it was helpful, and there's going to be a recorded version of this presentation available for review on our website at pjr.com. And I appreciate everybody's time. I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up. I hope you all have a great day. Thank you very much.